First of all, I want to say, I'm so grateful to see many people stand up against those groundless criticism of China and Chinese people. And the debate on the two systems is encouraging for me personally, despite a slight disappointment that no representative from China is part of that debate, since the debate is about China, right? And I finally saw a China expert with rich Chinese experience and observance, Arnaud, challenged the Google-based but widely quoted China critic Adrian Zenz. And first of all, Arnaud, could you please tell us about this debate? Is there any interesting backstage story? And what made you decide to participate in it? And I didn't see you interact with Zenz while you're sitting behind each other. So what's your opinion on your opponent's performance?
So first of all, thank you for inviting me to this interview. In terms of backstory, I mean, there were many geopolitical debates on China, and they didn't want to do that. They wanted to focus more on more philosophical type of discussion, which is what it was about systems, approach to governance and type of understanding of the world. That's what the debate was about. And also, it's important to know that this is a rather conservative institute. And I happen to have written quite a noticed article on Chinese philosophy in a US conservative magazine called American Affairs. So I think that's what put me on the map with them. They must have read it, and that's my guess as to why they contacted me. And in terms of my opponent, I mean, I knew obviously Adrian Zenz by reputation before the debate, because as you said, Frieda is very famous in Chinese circles. And so my personal opinion is that he basically tries to validate his preconceived biases with data, with anything that might validate it, which to me is not a good approach at all. As a serious, intellectually honest person, you need to be neutral, basically, and say, okay, I don't have any preconceived view. Let me see what the data says.
Yeah. I also have the same feeling when watching the videos that no matter what the question is, he holds that ideology, or he holds that core point.
Yeah.
And just focus on that point. No matter what the question is, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and sometimes quite it leads to even funny answers. Like one of his main points in the debates you must have seen was that the success of China was 100% due to the hard work of the Chinese people, and that it was despite the Chinese government. And then I was like, then what about all the other countries where people didn't succeed, like India, for instance? Does that mean that those people are not hard workers, or that they're intellectually inferior in some way to the Chinese? That's not true at all. It's on the main difference between China and those countries is not how hardworking the people are, how smart they are, and so on. Everyone is a human being at the end of the day. The big difference was the system of governance.
Being seated there and watching the debate, Arnaud and Zenz, could you give us a little comment on their performance?
Hi, Frieda. Thank you. It's nice to be here with everyone. First of all, I'd like to introduce the terminology of good Adrian and bad Adrian. I don't want to get confused with Adrian Zenz. I thought the I thought the very fact of the debate was extremely striking. That is, it's unusual to have debates in the US where a representative of the pro-China position is given an equal platform with figures like Adrian Zenz. And I thought that was both striking and encouraging. And it's interesting that there's a small but growing reality on especially the American right, surprisingly, in which people are open to hearing Chinese perspectives. Arnaud was just superb. But he was superb even though the question for the debate was badly posed in a certain way. That is, the question for the debate was, which is better, the American system or the Chinese system? But of course, my understanding of the Chinese foreign policy is that it doesn't try to claim that China has the uniquely best system that must be exported to all other polities around the globe. And that view is actually quite consistent with the classical Western view, which said there's a legitimate diversity of different types of political regime, and every people should have the form of political regime that best suits them in a certain way. Whereas the kind of liberal neoconservative view is that there's one best form that has to be imposed everywhere around the globe. So that the framing of the question was a little odd, and I think Arnaud dealt with this right away, right at the beginning of his talk, and dealt with it wonderfully. I think Zenz came across as a man with many opinions and few facts. That is, Arnaud's performance was so solid and convincing because it wasn't particularly argumentative, actually. It was a presentation of facts drawn from largely Western European sources, largely unimpeachable academic sources, and it really made Zenz look as though he's both biased and just lacking the factual substrate for his views. So that was a very powerful element of the debate, was facts versus opinions, really.
Yeah. So what about John?
I'll continue from where good Adrian left off, and I think Arnaud set out some very strong arguments, but these weren't quite addressed by Dr. Zenz. I think Zenz's arguments were very much plucked from. They are the sort of standard thing that you hear a lot. You know, they're fairly generic in this group of people I like to call the China watchers. They're sort of all-purpose. They could have been brought out at any time for any occasion, and these are your standard set of arguments. I drove from New York State, right, to attend this. I drove 3 hours plus, and the reason was, wow, they're willing to put somebody like Arnaud on, and he was given a good hearing. And of course, as it turned out, he won the debate. So this was actually an unusual crowd, an interesting crowd. And it was really striking that people were listening despite the horrendous anti-China rhetoric and propaganda that we've undergone.
One thing that many people did tell me after the debate was indeed that Adrian Zenz just didn't even defend his side of the debate, which was, at the end of the day, what I had to do on my side was to explain why the Chinese system had a lot of merits for the Chinese people. And what I had to do was to explain how the US-European system had even bigger merits to their own populations, and he didn't even touch on that at all. Even at some point, I don't remember his exact sentence, but I think he said that actually the US system is actually quite bad. So I was like, so yeah, so that was quite striking. He focused his entire side of the debate on a long litany of beefs he has with China, either drawn from his own reports that he himself wrote, or whatever he read in Western media. So it was like China is bad because of blah 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 blah. But that wasn't the point of the debate at all. It was a comparison of two systems on their respective merits.
As Arnold has mentioned several times in his speech, he said some accusations made by the West towards China or other countries outside of the Western alliances are actually more of a reflection of their own system. So in this sense, Zenz is very much honest. Does his opinion therefore reflect that the people and the government in his own country are separated?
That's a great question. I mean, that is one thing that I touch upon in my speech, because it's quite striking that there is a huge and growing lack of trust in public institutions in most Western countries. I don't remember the exact number for the US that I gave. I think it's below 20% of the American public that does trust their government on public institutions at large. Like I think even the US Congress is trust in the US Congress is below 10%, if I'm not mistaken. And it's the same in France, and in most Western countries. I think the number for France was 28% of the French public trust public institutions. So there is a divide in that sense. Another sense in which there is a divide between the Western public and their government is that, and there were some interesting studies done on that. I remember one from Princeton in 2014, for instance, whereby the correlation between what the people want and what the government does is almost none, which is quite impressive. So if you ask the American public, or even the French public, what do you want? How do we plan for the future, and so on? You have a set of response. Like I guess the American public, everyone is fairly aware of what those responses would be. Like less expensive education, something around gun violence, and all those topics, and then you watch what the U.S. government does, and there is no correlation there. So that clearly speaks to a divide in that sense as well. And what I said when it comes to China is you take any polling of the Chinese people, even Western polling of the Chinese people, and try to see if there is a divide, and there just isn't. So I brought up in my speech a fascinating study that was done by the Ash Center at the Harvard Kennedy School that studied in depth the Chinese population during, I think, 13 years on the ground, trying to assess if there was a lack of trust, a divide between the Chinese people on their government. And the conclusion of the report was that 93% of the Chinese people trust their government. And why wouldn't they? I mean, if you look at what the government has done for them over the past 30, 40 years, is very striking. And that's also something what the government does in China. If you had asked the Chinese people like 20, 30 years ago, what do you want for your future? So, I want to grow richer. I want to have a, bigger apartment and so on. The Chinese government certainly delivered in that regard. So yes, to go back to your question, Frieda, it is like very many things that comes from the West, what you call projection, I think.
Yeah, when I first heard this kind of remarks, I felt shocked. I said, what government's role? It should serve the people. That has been like embedded in our mindset. So I was shocked to hear such things. And like you said, it seems really exist in the Western society. What about other guests? You want to say something?
I do have a quick thought, which is that to understand Zenz's distinction between the people and the government, I think you have to understand the worldview of post-World War II Western liberalism. So this worldview holds that any society that doesn't conform to the very particular institutional pattern of liberal democracy must feature this split between regime and people. That is, the people must secretly be chafing under oppression and must secretly be yearning for liberation from their own government and their own regime. This is how the liberal thinks. So therefore, one has to, when talking about other societies that don't fit the Western pattern, one has to begin with this sharp distinction. And then the question is how to bring about this liberation that the people of China must secretly be yearning for. And that's the whole premise of Zenz's worldview. And you can't understand it without that premise. And I'd just like to add, this is completely antithetical to the classical Western conception of the relationship between people and regimes. The classical Western conception is that a regime form is the organic expression of a people's life and an organic expression of their culture. And this is why we see this in the classical conception, we see this legitimate diversity of regimes, that different people can have different types of regimes that fit their culture and history. And that's been replaced in modern liberalism by the idea that one size fits all and that secretly everybody yearns for the one model.
I too was struck by the way Zenz kept dividing the wanting to divide the people from the government, and the term they always use is a sort of regime. As Dr. Vermeule says, it's characteristic of liberalism to think of the government as a sort of mechanism above the people, a type of a machine that we are to judge by its formal perfection, actually, by its satisfying certain formal properties. That is, if it undergoes certain procedures, it satisfies, it looks a certain way, and it conducts certain processes, then it is legitimate. This view of the world is completely blind and deaf to any discussion of the outcomes or the goods that emerge from government, what government is supposed to do. So hence the emphasis on, going back to rights again and to this sort of formal perfection. If it doesn't satisfy, if it doesn't look like this, somebody like Zenz is completely uninterested in what the thing does, whether its results are horrendous for people or lead to sort of the eradication of poverty, for example. So that too was illustrated in the debate. Arnaud kept bringing up these things, what China has achieved in the last 30 years and so on. And this just didn't make a dent in Zenz's view. It didn't seem to affect him at all. It didn't seem to move the needle at all. So in that view, there isn't that organic relationship with there's only one kind of relationship, some representation, right, achieved through these elections. But in many societies, in Chinese society in particular, it's a complex relationship. It's also a social relationship. Government isn't just this thing that tacked on to a bunch of abstract individuals. It's as natural in a way a relationship as your relationship with family, as your relationship with clan, with people in your town. There is also government. So from the beginning, this is a relationship that's not alien, and has exactly that organic and complex relationship with people. And people do not. This liberal attempt, I find it really condescending and dehumanizing, actually. To keep saying, oh yeah, well, it's the Chinese people that, for example, that ludicrous argument that China is doing so well because its people are hardworking, and they're doing well in spite of their government. This is terribly condescending. It's as if they're not capable of government, or that government isn't actually an expression of their social and their organic and political being.
Yeah, I saw an interesting comment below the video. Another interesting comment that like Chinese government is like a parent, and people like.
Yeah.
Yes, I saw that. Yeah,
I read that. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Tell me about how you think about that comment. Like Vermeule, please.
Oh, I thought it was very striking. The idea of the paternalistic relationship between government and people, or the familial relationship with government and people, is absolutely central to classical Western conceptions of government, and it's absolutely anathema or kind of forbidden in current Western discourse. So it's for me, it's a remarkable indicator of the break between classical and modern conceptions. And it's utterly incomprehensible to liberalism, which, as John said, thinks that unchosen obligations are inherently unjust, and therefore the kind of unchosen obligations one naturally has to one's parents, to one's family, must be inherently unjust and must be undone. Whereas for the liberal, government therefore has to be a chosen obligation, so that people have to legislate for themselves through government, rather than relating in a natural and organic way to their own government, the way you would relate to your parents or to your family. So I thought it was a wonderful observation.
It's very right. There is a very different relationship between the Chinese people and their government, and also between the Chinese people on their history. I think to add on what good Adrian was saying, the West being disconnected from their traditional view of governance, of governance on the system of organization and so on. You don't feel this disconnection at all in China. You feel, in fact, a continuity with their past. And if you look, even the Chinese government, in many ways, draws from Chinese history. They've they've had lessons on governance for 2,500 years since the Qing dynasty, the first time China was unified under one government. And they made tons of mistakes in the past. They had tons of successes in the past, and so they draw from all of that to in a way continuously improve the system of governance. Whereas it looks like we in the West at some point had a huge break where we said, okay, everything in the past that we've done is basically wrong, and let us start from scratch and reinvent a completely new way of doing things. And of course, it's absurd when you think about it, because it cannot be that during, I don't know, 1,500 years we did everything wrong. So I think this also is a big source for the different way people view their governance in China and in the West.
This relationship between people in familial relationships, right? Parent and child, for example, and then between ruler and subject, these are fundamental relationships. They're what constitutes in Chinese culture your very humanity. You are not a human being outside of these relationships. It is through the fulfillment, the proper your education through these relationships and your proper conduct, in these relationships, that you become more fully human. And I think the same is it's the same as Dr. Vermeule points out in classical thought, that participation in the polity is the highest thing a person can do. Is the fulfillment of to fulfill oneself as a human being, to become a virtuous person, is to participate in a certain way, right? To achieve certain to have certain virtues and to participate in a certain way in a political space. But this thing is particularly acute and close to the heart of Chinese people. It isn't just that there's a proper relationship between the ruler and the ruled. In Confucian culture, the highest thing you can do is to be a public official. Is to be a good public official.
Still remember our last interview, that article? I quoted famous Chinese writer Lin Yutang's remarks, his insight in the relationship between the Chinese government and people. He compared the Western and Chinese society in terms of the politics. He said, like, the constitution presupposes that our rulers might be crooks who might abuse their power and violate our rights, in which case we should use the constitution as a weapon to defend ourselves. And in providing a comparison, he continued that the Chinese conception of government is a parent government, or government by gentlemen, who are supposed to look after the people's interests as parents, in whose hands they place their full confidence.
It goes back a while. If you visit the Summer Palace in Beijing, on the lake, you can see a boat made of marble, I think. It's to illustrate a very old Chinese saying. I can't remember from which dynasty it is, but every Chinese people knows it, which is the government is like a boat carried by the people. If it doesn't steer well, then it can be sunk, basically. You must know the exact...
人能载舟，亦能覆舟, right?
Yeah,